Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and today we're going to talk about a FASB staff Q&A related to nonprofits. So this one is a very interesting one. As many of you are aware, this year for private companies, the revenue recognition standard is effective, so for calendar 2019. However, for nonprofits with June 30 year ends, if they were an entity that was a conduit bond obligor and had a June 30 year end, it would have been 2019. Those that do not have conduit debt would then be switched over to being the June of 2020. And so as a result, in 2018, FASB issued a standard on 2018-08, and that standard helps us understand when something is a contribution versus when is an exchange transaction. But it also addresses another area, which is the definition of a condition under contribution accounting. So with after the result of 2018-08, many things that are currently treated as exchange transactions today might potentially now fall under contribution accounting. And so FASB at the same time decided to address an area in contribution accounting that needed to be addressed, really clarifying when something's a restriction versus a condition. So as part of that, they issued that standard in 2018, and as part of implementation, nonprofits had asked several questions regarding the implementation of that standard, and that has resulted in the FASB staff providing a staff Q&A. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that staff Q&A and what does it mean as we adopt this new revenue recognition standard. So this was issued in June of 2019, and it is a response to the concept of a barrier that is included now in contribution accounting for a condition. So instead of looking for a future uncertain event, the new concept is that you have to have a barrier and either a right of return or right of release. There are three barriers that are indicated in the guidance. The first one is a measurable performance-related barrier or other barrier. The second one is the extent to which a stipulation limits discretion on the conduct of the activity, and so conduct being one of those key words there. And the third one, whether the actual stipulation is related to the purpose of the agreement. So those were the three that were introduced. Inevitably, we had some questions pop up. The first one's related to budgets, and this is a really interesting question. Because some people have the view that a budget would fit in the context of a limited discretion, right? So if there is limited discretion on how you spend your money, then that would be an indicator of a barrier and would be an indicator of a condition. However, other people said that it's really just a general administrative type of requirement. It'd be routine administrative task, and therefore the third item there that would not be related to the purpose as opposed to being more administrative in nature, and therefore would not be. So that was a question. How should the limited discretion indicator be applied when determining whether a budget and related stipulations within the grant are deemed to be a barrier? So that was one of the key questions. And the answer is, sort of it depends. But for the most part, the existence of a budget and a requirement to adhere to it within deviations would not be in and of themselves a barrier, right? So if you have to get pre-approval, if you have a significant deviation in spend, for example, more than 10% of that particular line item, would not be considered would not be a factor for considering whether a barrier exists. So that would not typically go over. However, when we think about this, if we look at the budget and it would normally be followed within a deviation normally viewed as a guardrail, then in that scenario, it would not be an indicator of a barrier to entitlement, and therefore it would you would need to have something else that would really trigger that treatment of a condition here. So if there's just following it and they're just trying to provide guidance, then that's not telling you the conduct of the activity, right? So they're not limiting your discretion on the conduct. They're just giving you sort of guide rails as you go through it. However, as they said, it is judgment, right? So it depends on the facts and circumstances. Some indicators may be more significant than others, and no indicator is determinative. So you do have to look at the facts and circumstances for each grant to determine whether there is a barrier. So they're not giving you an absolute here. You have to really look at the facts and circumstances. The other area that got a lot of attention was in the area of cost sharing, right? Many federal grants include the concept of cost sharing. Some people viewed cost sharing as being similar to a matching provision, right? So if you look in the examples under the measurable performance related barrier, one of the examples is going to be matching requirement. Other people said, on the other hand, that when they do these contracts and they have cost sharing, they've already done their due diligence and they're sure that they're going to be able to meet the cost sharing agreement, and therefore that would be routine compliance as opposed to a barrier to entitlement. So there's a little bit of controversy. So the question was, how should an entity determine whether a cost sharing provision in an agreement is a barrier to entitlement? And second phase, should cost sharing provisions in an agreement be analogized to matching when determining how to account for the timing and pattern of recognition? And again, the answer is going to be, it depends. So a cost sharing provision should be considered a barrier if it is clear that the entitlement to the grant funding is contingent on the recipient meeting a cost sharing requirement. The consideration about whether the recipient is likely to meet it is not going to be a factor when determining. Remember, one of the things that the new standard took away, 2018-08, was that probability assessment regarding a condition. So we no longer think about it as a future uncertain event. If there's a barrier, then you have to recognize it regardless of whether you are completely sure you're going to meet it or not. But they do tell us that we do need to consider the judgmental aspect of it. So you need to read the actual requirement to determine whether the grant requires raising incremental funds from an outside source, like a matching provision, or simply spending resources other than grant resources. So that would be a cost sharing provision. So you want to look at the, what does the actual terms and conditions say? Is it like matching or is it more like cost sharing? And then whether it depends on meeting that requirement, and then the appropriate timing that would go through. So you really need to look at the wording as we go through this. So they give us a couple of different scenarios. So in scenario 1, the organization must provide from its own resources, so going back to that cost sharing, an amount equal to a certain percentage of the grant in each year of a multi-year grant in order to be entitled, right? So in that scenario, you must have cost sharing in each year. The grant states that if the cost share is not met, the grantor has the right to have the recipient return. So again, you have to have a barrier and a right of return. So when we go through and we look at this, similar to a matching provision, there is a barrier because if each year there's an annual cost sharing requirement. So each year you have to actually raise that cost funding or else they have to give that portion back. Now the question is, what do they have to give back, the whole amount or a portion? So grant fund revenue should be deferred until the cost sharing provision is met if entitlement to the annual grant is contingent on meeting it. You should review the grant to determine the amount of funding that's at risk, which is subjective to the right of return or right of release in the amount of unmet cost share. So do you have to give it all back? Do you have to give back the portion that was not met in cost share, right? So you have to take a look and read the terms and conditions. However, scenario 2 is a little bit different. So here the organization must provide from its own resources, so again, cost share, an amount equal to a certain percentage of the total grant by the end of the last year of a multi-grant. So now a multi-year grant. So in this scenario, instead of having to meet it each year, you have the entire length of the grant to meet the cost share. So you don't have to, in a particular year, have that percentage. Right? So now the grant does not contain a specific requirement that must be met each year. And if the cost share is not met by the end of the agreement, then there's a right of return. So now when we look at the analysis, it's a little bit different. A year-to-year deferral would not be necessary in scenario 2. In this scenario, a barrier does exist. However, when we look at the timing, there would be a little bit different. So in there, we would only look at it if the remaining portion of the award that is for future years does not exceed the amount at risk. So thinking about it, you have even if you're not meeting it in the current year, right? As long as the amount that you're about to receive in the future is covered, right, then you don't have to worry about the current year having a deferral, right? But you have to obviously look at the wording to make sure that that's true. But you're always looking at what is at risk. So they give us an example. So here, a grantor awards a 5-year grant at $100,000 per year with a requirement that the grantee provide $200,000 of cost share before the end of the grant term. So this is not annual, this is over that 5-year period. The agreement indicates that failure to meet the cost sharing may result in grant funds being returned to the funder in an amount equal to that by which the actual cost share is less than the required. So the maximum that you're out of pocket is the amount that you haven't met in cost share. So they're going to give you, right, a $500,000 grant, and the maximum that you would possibly have to return is the 200,000, right? So at maximum, only the last 2 years of the grant is really at risk. The first 3 years are easygoing, right? So the first 3 years are not at risk, and you would just recognize those as revenue as long as there are no other barriers, right? So again, you have to look for all of the different barrier indicators. When we get to the fourth year, now we have to worry, because in the fourth year, we have to look to see what have we met so far in cost sharing. So if we have at least 100,000, right, for that 1 year's 100,000, then we wouldn't have to do anything, right? We would not have any deferral. We would just recognize that revenue. However, if only 60,000 had been met, then 40,000 is at risk, because remember, we have to get to 200,000. And so next year we would have to have 140,000. So 100,000 for the next year plus the 40,000 from this year is going to be what's at risk. And so we would defer then that 40,000. So really, this was designed to provide examples of certain language and what that impact would be. So hopefully this is a good overview of what that staff Q&A is. I would recommend you go to the FASB website and pull it down and take a look at it. We've gone over the examples, but I think it's important to always read through all of the background information as well. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Genuine Learning blog, and I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.